Yeah, what we're going to be talking about today is some of the high-level findings that came out of some research that I did together with a project reference group. So I guess before that, Donna mentioned that at the moment I'm working in the remote housing program. I've been there for about 1 year, but before that I was here at CDU for about 2.5 years working on a couple of different research projects. So the first of those was the Whole of Community Engagement Initiative, and then the second was the Northern Territory Indigenous Higher Education Policy Review Project. So that was ran over the course of not quite a year, so it started the start of 2017, and then we finished up with a final report in early 2018, and today I'll be talking about that with Shane here as well. Just a note for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are in the room that this presentation does contain a few photographs of people who are deceased. So I also just like to pay my respects to the custodians of the land on which we meet, the Marikea people. I would like to quickly acknowledge that the funding for the research project, some annoying little animations in there, the funding for the research project that we did in 2017 came from the Australian Government's Higher Education Participation and Partnerships Program. Also like to pay a huge acknowledgement or thank you to the project reference group who played a very, very important role to this research, and Shane will talk about them a bit later on. Thank you to Batchelor Institute who partnered with us on data collection and analysis, and we're also involved in the reference group. And also finally to my PhD supervisors who will be guiding me in my ongoing journey after this stage. So as you'll find out a bit more as well, we're going to be going back and using some of the same data, sort of building on the framework that we developed through this research project to continue on to develop into a PhD with a lot of the same people involved. So as I said, we finished up the HEP research project at the start of 2018. The final report is available on the internet if you'd like to check it out. And then as of last year onwards, we're developing the theoretical and conceptual framework for this research and going back and reanalyzing the data to develop a bit more. And we do have ethics approval for both of those. Do you want to talk about the policy context now, or some stuff later? When we get to that slide?
We can come back.
Yep.
Yep.
I won't go into this too much in detail because we'll be talking about some of these things later on today, I understand, but just to give you a bit of an indication of the data the literature that is out there, of which there is a lot. So there's been a lot published in terms of various historical influences on Indigenous higher education policy. So there's been a couple of really interesting PhDs that have been completed as of late. So one by Melita Hogarth, which has looked at historical Indigenous higher policy from a human rights framework. So it centres on the UN piece of work. And then also, mental blank. Holt completed a thesis telling the stories of the National Aboriginal Education Committee. So that's looking at historically what was their influence over time. So that's really interesting as well. There's heaps and heaps out there in terms of enablers to participation and completion. So things like looking at the importance of cultural safe spaces and financial support, tutorial assistance, things like that. We know about the influence on neoliberalism on the education setting, so the whole idea that there's a big focus on things like bums on seats as opposed to actually thinking about the real power of education and how to facilitate that. And then I guess in the last few decades we have seen a growing recognition on the power structures that are embedded within our education systems as they exist. So the area of critical race studies that was pioneered by people like Gloria Ladson-Billings and Eileen Morton-Robinson, where that talks about whiteness and people who are white being positioned as being normative, and everything else is ranked or positioned in relation to that, and that has influences on communication and research in our everyday lives essentially. And then Very topical of late is the Indigenous data sovereignty agenda. So that whole idea is around Aboriginal people very rightly being in control of the collection design of research education policy and the use, collection, not only involvement but ownership over that whole process in terms of use of data. So just a brief look at stats. So Simon touched briefly, so this does just have completion, again, enrolments, I should say participation. Completion is another story, which you'll hear more about later. But if we look at the Northern Territory as a whole, in terms of the population, we know 30% of the population is Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, whereas the student body, domestic enrolled higher ed student body at Bachelor and CDU over there on the left, is only at 7.2%. So although VET is going pretty well in terms of participation, we're not yet at parity if we're looking at the higher ed space, and it's a similar story nationally. So the whole idea behind this research, we had a bit of scope to shape what the research was going to be about, and we knew it was going to be some sort of policy review. And people were saying, well, we don't want it just to be another policy review. We want this this research project to be focused on what do we as Indigenous people, having experience in the policy development and implementation space, what do we think has been successful? So we wanted to build an understanding about Indigenous perspectives of success in historical Indigenous higher ed policy and practice. So to do that, we had to think about what does success actually mean. So if we think about policies being set up to achieve a particular purpose, success means the completion, the achievement of that purpose. So that was a big part of what we had to look at first. And then looking at socio-political factors that have shaped policy and practice, and then how have these factors supported or constrained progress towards parity of outcomes. Do you want to talk about the reference group?
The reference group. Again, I was roped in. I probably wasn't there when the decision was made that one, I'd be included on the reference group, and two, I'd be the chair of it. But that's how it ended up. That listing, of course, is grand. We've tried to go for a broad sweep of people, either practitioners in the policy area in higher education, or people who had lived through it here in the NT, or both. I keep forgetting that I'm going to be here for 30 years. It's just gone so quick, Donna. Yeah, I still think like I was 21. Going through the list, you've got Kim Robertson over there, my esteemed colleague. We were at the beginning, shall we say, in 2011, when the office of the Vice-Chancellor and Indigenous Leadership was first started up. There's only a very small team of 4 starting off, and 3 of those people are in the room. Myself, Kim, and the lady sitting over in the back corner in the red top, Annie. Annie was the business manager, office executive extraordinaire, who did everything, basically. It made the PVC and Kim and I's position so much easier back then. And we built it. We built the foundations back then. Dr. Wendy Ludwig, what people would know, is now the Deputy CEO VET at BITE. Tracy Woodruff is still a lecturer here, currently doing her PhD. Robin, I think, is still on leave. Is currently employed at BITE, but is still on leave. John is in the room. I thought I saw him. There he is at the back. John's from BITE again, Associate Professor, Research Leader, very influential in this particular project. Dr. Kevin Gillen. Is that your supervisor, Donna? No? No, it's my old age. Dr. Kevin Gillen. Still at the Department of Education, do we know? No. Retired? Yes. Lucky bugger. Yeah. And Joe Brown, my good old friend, we met when I was still a cowboy. and we started playing the Thugby League, and he's now a director in the NTA department. Couldn't come today, very busy, doing something very similar, I think, a talk like this one this morning. Velda, is Velda here? No? Velda Shannon from Tennant Creek. Played a part in our remote area campus down there in Tennant Creek some time ago, and also her partner. Is it her partner? Brother? Jeffrey, as well. I see Jeffrey's not on there, but I used to talk to him outside this group to make sure that we got as broad a perspective as possible. And also we have Rhonda here as an honorary research fellow, but has a long, extensive history in Indigenous research and engagement with this university. Okay. Gabrielle Hill, I think, is now at La Trobe University, has taken up a position there, but she was formerly employed at Bite. No, that's a different lady.
Yeah, she's one of my law students.
Yes, I see student ambassador there, but I've just had her mixed up with the conversation Kim and I were having yesterday. Sorry, people. One of two of our Indigenous student ambassadors, Gabrielle Hill, law student.
Yep.
Yes, and recently law graduate. Is that correct, Mark?
I'm not sure. I think
that's
so.
correct.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yep.
I didn't know this was sensitive points. So what we've tried to do is get as broad a perspective as possible. That's not the list. Yeah, yeah, and to include back when Don and I were doing our diplomas and we started sitting on committees when we first got employed. I got employed in '93 here, so I've been here since '93, and we insisted back then that students, as one of the main client groups, be on any of our faculty committees back then. Our advantage back then, though, when we had that they were mature age, of course these are maturing, but these are mature age students who already had families and employment careers, and they came and they brought a lot of value to our committees back then. So since then, any committee that I tend to sit on, I always ask, is there a student representative on it? It's just something that I do. Is that all I'm doing for this bit?
Yep.
Okay. I shall now move aside and let Kat take over again.
So, as Shane has talked about, I feel really lucky to have the people involved that are involved. Got an excellent group of people who have a lot of experience, as Shane said, across a really broad range of areas. Tried to get people involved from remote as well as urban. And as I am not Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander, it's been really important for me to be guided by this group of people because, as I said, the focus of this was really telling the story of historical definitions of success in policy from the perspectives of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. So I've really tried to be guided by them as much as I can, and I try to engage with them as often as I can. We have regular catch-ups, and they also have been involved in presentations and co-authorship of any outputs. So just to touch quickly on the data that we looked at, we started off by doing some policy mapping. So you can see along the bottom here, you've got a representative timeline. So that was looking at policy data from since about the 1960s. So looking at what was happening nationally in terms of policy directions, what consultative groups were in place. So it was identified very early on that the role of the different consultative groups over time has been really important in terms of shaping policy. We also looked at what were the institutions in the Northern Territory at the territory level doing in response to these national policies, and then you can see in the blue line coming up here, we looked at statistics, so that was student enrolments and completions. And then in the background, to bring it all together, we did interviews with Indigenous people who had experience in policy implementation. I'll skip that. Okay, so to start off with, just to mention briefly that we have had a paper published, so that was in terms of looking at that bottom line to tell the story of how policy has evolved over time. And I'm going to talk through that a little bit on the next slide, but really what came out of that was that there has been some clear shifts in terms of policy approaches and directions. And we looked at 3 key areas. So what was the government of the day in particular decades or eras? What were other sort of socio-political events that were happening that may have influenced education or higher education? So, for example, the Northern Territory intervention came up quite often. And then finally, as I said, the role of Indigenous consultative groups. So you probably can't see any of this, I just realised. So I'm just going to bring out some of the key points. So basically it's a timeline telling the story from the 1960s up to where we are now. And across the top here you've got key international events or documents that were seen as being influential by the reference group. In the middle here there is national policy directions or events, and then along the bottom is the Northern Territory government. And then the black and white here is government of the day, so black is Liberal and white is Labor. This timeline is available in the final report as well as that paper that I mentioned as well if you'd like to have a closer look at it. So to briefly tell the story, so in the 1960s we know that it was still all about assimilation, so a lot of the schools were still run by the missions, and the purpose of education, as made quite specific in a number of policy documents, was to breed Aboriginal culture out of existence, so to assimilate. It was only in the late 1960s that Aboriginal people were formally included within higher education policy. So that came with AB study, so financial assistance to support people to access the system. We saw when Whitlam came in 1972, he had broadly the big focus on self-determination, so that in the higher ed setting that was around training of Aboriginal people to teach them their own people and their own communities. So with that came a big focus on bilingual education, and then there was also a big report that came out in the 1970s that established a sort of national goal to train 1,000 teachers by 1990. And we saw the National Aboriginal Education Committee established in the 1970s, and that consisted of representatives from right the way through the education continuum, so early childhood right through to tertiary ed, and that also had representatives from all around the country. So that was a mechanism for providing a really coordinated approach to achieving that one goal that was established. And the focus really was on enabling access and participation within the higher ed system. We saw some changes in the 1980s where the focus sort of shifted to equity, so we saw some legislation come in. We also saw in the late 80s, the Dawkins report said that the government would no longer be able to support pay for people's university degrees, because up until that time it had been free. So that's when HECS was introduced. And a number of key reports saw quite a lot of injections of funds into student support initiatives for Aboriginal students in the mid-80s as well. So as Shane said, we saw some changes happening at the national level in the 1990s that really brought about this culture of, it was the beginning of this stuff essentially, so where institutions were forced to be more accountable, and they started developing their own business plans and reporting against those to demonstrate their performance. And so over into the 2000s and onwards, we're seeing that big focus where institutions are essentially competing against each other for students. What else from this slide? I'll just mention briefly as well that the NATSI HEC is still in existence at the moment. So that's a National Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Higher Education Consortium. So that is a member-based organisation who advocate for the needs of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in higher ed, but it plays a proxy role. So there was also the Indigenous Higher Education Advisory Committee, which were a formalised body who provided advice to government. However, that was abolished in 2015, I believe. We also saw FEPI So when the NAEC was established, FEPI was the Northern Territory specific body that was to provide advice to government on the needs of Indigenous people in education, and it went through various changes. However, it was formally abolished as well in 2015. Was a lot to go through there. So then, just to talk through some of the high-level findings that came out of this research when we were looking back as to what's changed. John Gunther and myself were both independently looking at, so John was looking at old bachelor documents, so that was annual reports, strategic plans and old program reviews, and I was doing the same for Charles Darwin University. So prior to about the early 2000s, it was quite easy to make the link in terms of what the institutions were doing in response to national policy at the national level. And then we both came to the same conclusion that from about 2000 onwards, when we saw this increasing focus on competition, that it wasn't as easy to make the link between national policy directions and implementation at the territory level, which was quite interesting. So obviously from that point onwards, as the institutions were, they were sort of more focused on their own financial sustainability. I hopefully will have shown to you that there were a number of Indigenous consultative groups that were quite active, particularly in the late 70s, early 80s, and over time we've seen a gradual disbandment of those groups. So that's obviously going to have implications if we're thinking about how policies are created and from whose worldviews are they conceptualised. In terms of quantitative measuring of success, we could only get hold of a consistent data set from around 2000s onwards, and before that it was really a case of digging out, trying to see what numbers we could find. So in the annual reports of City and Bachelor there were some numbers reported, but it was just really all over the shop. And then we also got hold of a few program reports that told us a little bit, but yeah, really inconsistent ways of measuring success over time.
Kat, sorry, just to interrupt you. You've got about 5 minutes.
Okay, cool. Almost done. And then this is just a snippet. Again, all of this presentation is just really high-level findings because I don't have time to talk through it in any amount of detail, but just to give you some indication, hopefully you can read that. I'll give you a moment to read those quotes. This was when we were talking to the key informants about definitions of success in higher ed. So obviously it came out quite strongly. A number of people said, well, success means completing units or courses, but there was also a range of responses that were a lot more broad than that. So whether that be around representation in the student and staff body or in employment figures as a result of completing higher ed courses, whether that be navigating a system that is so completely different to your own, or that where you're being taught education that it's quite difficult to relate to, or whether that feel like your worldview is really valued in the education setting. So if you look at that final report, the recommendations that we made really were focused on re-establishment of formalised Aboriginal consultative groups that are able to provide advice to government and have a say over funds. So I just mentioned briefly that from here on in, as I said, we're going back to look at some of the data, and we're really focused on the problematization of policy issues. So what are these policies actually setting out to achieve, and who's deciding what the purpose of these policies are? So do you have anything to add?
I do, but it's more than the 2 minutes we might have. I'll just jump in. Wind forward to well, we've got another 8 slides that we had prepared here. At the end of the day, any university there are only three core business elements, and that's teaching, learning, research. That's it, teaching, learning, research. Everything else in a university, in my mind, thinking as a cowboy, exists to service teaching, learning, research activities. That includes the executive right down to the cleaners. But at the end of the day, it's like a football club. That team out, we have to put a team on the paddock, which is our teaching staff, and deliver teaching, learning, and research. Now, learning is what students do, so you've got to get your pedagogical systems right for different disciplines. Teaching is what your staff do in terms of delivery. And then your research, of course, is either external issues, what we do here, or some research, internal research, which you look at what you do in terms of performance and you apply that back in and you just keep improving that. Because, you know, football club analogy, we want to win a grand final. So you're either training to win a grand final or you're just training to play football. There's a big difference between the two. So we have the learning components in terms of numbers. So this is, for me, from 96 onwards in this country, it's about outcomes. The focus of policy, national policy, and then state and territory responses is about outcomes. So it's numbers. It's bums on seats. Bums on seats. When it comes to the teaching, again, for me, if there's any money that a university can get its hands on to hire more staff, that's not to employ teaching staff, in my experience. And this experience is about 3 decades now. It's not to employ teaching staff, it's to employ admin staff. So for me, there's a problem in getting the right people to teach the curriculum. Curriculum is the learning side of things. To a group of people who, in that last comment there about do I feel comfortable in this setting, given that it's not from my cultural setting, my own cultural setting from back home. So that's been one of the bugbears of my life in tertiary education, because the only lever that a university can pull with any influence and how it influences the teaching in those three activities is curriculum. That's our core product. It's our core product. It's the product that attracts Indigenous Australians. It's the product. It's the one thing that when an Indigenous Australian student enrolls and they say, that I can relate to that, I can see that. And not only that, I might see Mark Munich, who's a recent graduate, re-employed back into the law faculty, do some tutoring. I don't know, it's just a suggestion. I'm just throwing it out. It's things like that. It's things like that. You know. I mean, just forgetting my obsession with being Griffith, just forget that for a second. But it is, after 3 decades, I come up with the same, that's the only solution that I come up with. And Greg is an old master of mine from my diploma and bachelor days, and I quite openly say that I am what I'm taught, and I am what I am. And I am, in terms of genealogy, academic genealogy, I'm a product of Greg. We have genealogies of different professors and lecturers, and Greg has been a very influential one of mine, and another, Brian Devlin, I don't mind saying that, in terms of curriculum is the lever. Curriculum is the lever. Because then you build everything else after that. That's all I was going to add, and it's not even on the slides. And I've gone way over time because Donna is now out of the seat.